The sewing that you have been doing and the sewing samples that you have so far done on your fabric, the stitch length on your machines has been set to 2. So the gray dial on the right hand side of your machine goes from 0 to 4. Sometimes it can go to 5. Sometimes it can go as far as 7. That number indicates the length of the stitch. So each time the needle goes in and out of the fabric, it creates a stitch, and that stitch has a particular length. If it's 0, it's not going anywhere. If it's 2, it's moving 2 millimeters, and each stitch length is 2 millimeters long, or it could be as much as 7. When we baste, we often have to baste fabrics together. So right here I have 2 separate pieces of fabric, and these 2 pieces are going to be joined together. Now imagine this is, let's say, a sleeve that you are going to add to a shirt. Oftentimes you are going to do something called baste. You are going to baste the 2 pieces of fabric together. A basting stitch removes easily. It's not a permanent stitch. If you sew anything with a basting stitch, it's not permanent. It's going to break. It's going to fall apart. So the basting stitch is the longest stitch your machine is capable of doing. It might be 4 on your dial, it might be 5 on your dial, it might be 7 on your dial, but it's never less than 4. So whatever that stitch length is, you are going to set that on your sewing machine. My sewing machine here that I have goes to 5, meaning a 5 millimeter stitch length. You are going to sew 5/8 distance from the edge of the fabric. You're going to set your machine at the longest stitch length it has, and you never backstitch when you're basting. A basting stitch will not have any backstitch. So you just simply stitch along the edge of your fabric until you reach the other end. And let's look at these stitches. Each one of these stitches is very long, much longer than normal stitches are. So by comparison, I'm actually going to go ahead and do 2.5, which is half of what you just saw me do, and that distance, that 2.5, is the normal distance that you sew when you're sewing anything, garments, bags. It's the standard distance. So I'm going to put these 2 here next to each other so that you can see how they look different, okay? And they are going to look different. One of these, the stitching is much shorter than the other. And over here where there's a little more shadow, you can actually tell that there's a difference between these. The long stitches are basting stitches. These are never meant to be permanent. They are always a stitch that at some point will be removed, most likely will be removed, and I will show you about removing a basting stitch. Basting stitches sew a lot quicker than a 2.5 regular stitch. So here you've got your basting stitch, and from the back side, I didn't pull my threads, but from the back side, normally on a basting stitch, you come back and you can pull. It's always easier for some reason to pull the bobbin thread out than it is to pull the top thread out, but I'm going to show you how on the basting stitch, if I just pull on it, it removes the stitch, and that's completely gone, and here it is on the front side. So a basting stitch just comes right out. If I do the same thing here on my smaller 2.5, it's just not going to do that. I'm not going to be able to pull it. I'm going to break things. I'm going to tear the fabric. So a basting stitch removes, it doesn't normally stay in the fabric, but it's very important to know the difference between the sizes of these stitches, why one is 5 millimeters, why one is 2.5, why sometimes you will be asked to sew with a 3 millimeter stitch length, and so on. If you are doing a curved line, so when we were doing our 90-degree angle lines, I asked you to shorten your stitch length. So in order for you to get a good angle at the corners, if you go to 2 millimeters, you can more accurately hit the corner point that you are sewing. If I have too long of a stitch, I'm either going to come short or I'm going to go past where I want to go. So I make my stitches shorter when I'm going to do a corner. That's one example of why you would change stitch lengths. So the stitch lengths are determined by what you're sewing, but a basting stitch is called a basting stitch, and that is the longest stitch that your machine can do, and that is also a temporary stitch. You never back stitch the beginning and end of a basting stitch.